Hello and welcome to the Hayloft Hour. I am your host Jordan, otherwise known as SpottedBayProductions. I have been viewing the world through the ears of a horse since I was 2 years old, and this podcast is my attempt at uncovering the dark side of the equine industry, true crime, scandals, and horror stories that might otherwise stay locked away in the hayloft forever. My purpose is to make these stories well known so that we can make sure they never happen again and to let others who may find themselves in these situations know that they are not alone. Make sure to join us on social media to follow my daily life with my 2 horses. You can find us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, all at Spotted Bay Productions. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe wherever you listen and share it with your friends. If you have an episode suggestion or a personal story that you would like to submit, email it to me at spottedbay@gmail.com. But please leave out the personal info and just leave behind the juicy details. I do want to say this is now technically our 5th episode, and last week we hit 1,000 listens, which just absolutely blew my mind. I am so excited that y'all are enjoying this, and I hope to keep growing because writing these episodes is a lot of fun for me, and I learned so much about parts of the horse industry that I might not have ever known about. In today's episode, we will be covering what has been said is the largest loss of unborn or newborn foals in Kentucky's history and maybe ever. As you may guess, this episode includes discussion of foal abortion, horse illness, and death, as well as a lot of medical terminology and descriptions. So if these are uncomfortable topics for you, please feel free to skip this episode, and we look forward to seeing you next time. The culprit in this case makes it less of a true crime story, but it's still a mysterious tragedy that hit the horse industry very hard. All information in this podcast has been found online and compiled for your listening pleasure. Inaccuracies or out-of-date information is always a possibility. This is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Spring is an exciting time on horse farms. The grass starts to green up, the snow is melting from the fence posts, and we all begin to shed layers as we work and ride. On breeding farms, this time of year is extra exciting as the warmer weather and longer days bring mares to the end of their gestation periods and they begin to foal. It's so exciting to see a brand new wobbly foal trying to figure out its legs for the first time. Within no time, they're taking their first drink from mom and exploring their surroundings. This joyous time, however, was put on hold on April 26, 2001, when veterinarians were ultrasounding pregnant mares on breeding farms in central Kentucky. Unfortunately, 2 of these ultrasounds revealed no fetal heartbeat and were classified as EFL, early fetal loss. The original purpose of these ultrasounds was to just find out the sex of the foals, but little did everyone know this was only the beginning of what was about to come. During these examinations, mares displayed symptoms such as discharge, mild colic, or low-grade fever, but were otherwise healthy mares. The fetuses were surrounded by echogenic fluid. Don't worry, I didn't know what that meant either, but from what Google told me, echogenic basically means that a substance is capable of reflecting or echoing ultrasound waves. So there was this cloudy substance around the fetuses within the womb. 2 days after these fetuses were found to have no heartbeat, another mare on a different farm was observed to be carrying a non-viable fetus. This mare, however, was in her last trimester of gestation, making this late fetal loss, or LFL. Within less than 3 weeks, these cases of fetal loss skyrocketed to over 450 cases within Kentucky alone. EFL cases were being seen in mares usually between 40 to 80 days of gestation, but up to 140 days, and LFL mares were losing fetuses from 10 months gestation until full term. Full-term pregnancies for horses are typically 320 to 380 days, with an average usually being 330 days or about 11 months. This was clearly an epidemic, and professionals in every field were scrambling to find the cause. Most mares who lost pregnancies did not show any major clinical symptoms. Blood work was normal, and mares typically recovered fine after the fetal loss. Placenta examinations did show pale brown color and were thickened and swollen. This was accompanied by a thickened yellow umbilical cord. The major connection between these hundreds of cases was bacterial placentitis. But why would there be such a major spike in this with seemingly no connection between cases? Along with fetal loss, 2 other diseases were starting to spike. Horses of any age, sex, or breed were displaying unusually high rates of fibrinous pericarditis, characterized by tachycardia, muffled heart sounds, lethargy, and other cardiovascular symptoms, as well as unilateral uveitis, or inflammation of one eye. Fibrinitis pericarditis cases did present a bacteria that was similar to EFL and LFL cases, but again, there was no apparent cause of these illnesses. Scientists from every branch of the industry were on this case. Veterinarians, forage agronomists, equine scientists, entomologists, weed scientists, nutritionists, and even meteorologists were in on trying to figure out what was going on. Everyone was doing what they could to try to find out what was causing such a massive loss of foals in the state of Kentucky. This epidemic had also spread to surrounding states such as West Virginia, Southern Ohio, and Tennessee. The loss of foals peaked by mid-May, and by June 1st, case numbers were back to what they would be in any normal year. In this short span of 2001, nearly 5,000 foals were lost in the state of Kentucky. Approximately 3,500 of them were thoroughbreds, and the remaining foals were of other breeds such as quarter horses and paints. I've seen varying numbers for estimates for these, but I saw these numbers a few times, so I stuck with them, but just know that you may see slightly different numbers depending on where you look. How could so much life be lost in just a few weeks and still no one could figure out what happened? To make matters worse, this exact same thing happened again in 2002, the following year. Something similar also happened in 1981. Similar weather patterns were seen in all of these years as well, a very warm period, followed by a frost, and then a drought. Back in 1981, this massive foal loss was attributed to fescue toxicosis. Fescue toxicosis is pretty widely recognized in Kentucky. Even though this is called the bluegrass state, you really can't throw a rock without hitting some tall fescue. It's a great forage grass for all livestock, as long as it's managed properly. The majority of tall fescue in Kentucky is infected with an endophyte, which is a fungus that lives inside the plant. This fungus helps the plant tolerate tough conditions like drought or heavy grazing, but it also produces a toxic compound called ergovaline. Ergovaline causes vasoconstriction, or a closing of blood vessels. Vasoconstriction in pregnant mares can lead to issues such as thickened placentas or low or no milk production. This usually results in prolonged gestation, though, not necessarily fetal loss. Tall fescue can also affect cattle and can lead to things like overheating or gangrene due to lack of blood flow. Fescue toxicosis and ergovaline and everything associated with it has a lot of research surrounding it, and if you're unfamiliar, I encourage you to explore it more online, but all you need to know here is that even though the symptoms may have somewhat matched, it wasn't fescue that caused this massive foal loss. By May of 2001, the Kentucky State veterinarian Dr. Don Nodder gave this epidemic an official name, Mare Reproductive Loss Syndrome, or MRLS. During the 2001 peak of foal loss, experts were recommending all kinds of things to mare owners to cover any possible cause. Educated guesses as to what was happening included mycotoxins, ergot poisoning, phytoestrogens, toxic plant compounds, bad feed, and more. Mare owners were advised to keep samples of feces, grain, and anything else they could think of that may have affected mares that experienced fetal loss. A lot about this case reminds me of the current pandemic that we're living in. Numbers increased so rapidly and there was little to nothing known about it. Scientists were all just doing their best to figure out how to prevent this from happening to more mares in the future. It was estimated that 25% of the foal crop in 2001 was lost, with abortion rates on some farms exceeding 60%. The estimated economic loss between the 2001 and 2002 MRLS spikes was $500 million. Similar events also occurred in Australia in 2004 and in Florida and New Jersey in 2006. How could such a major loss have occurred right under the noses of some of the most prominent horse experts in the world, and a cause still hadn't been found? One thing that connected about 75% of the cases was the presence of Streptococcus or Actinobacillus bacteria in the fetuses. However, it was determined that these were opportunistic bacteria and had not actually caused the disease and ultimate fetal loss. So basically something else was occurring and these bacteria just showed up after the fact. Something else was happening first that let these bacteria in, but what was it? A normal fetal loss rate for equine pregnancies is about 10%, usually due to non-infectious causes. These losses could be spontaneous or perhaps due to trauma, but rarely are they due to bacteria, viruses, or fungus. Some better-known infectious causes of fetal loss in horses include EHV1, EHV4, and EVA. These all have vaccines available, however, they are not as likely to cause a massive storm of fetal loss as seen in this case, especially without clinical symptoms. Other common causes of abortion are twins, umbilical cord abnormalities, stress, malnutrition, or toxicity. But again, none of these would happen on such a massive scale without a very obvious clinical symptom pointing to the fetal loss. Some foals were surviving birth, but were born extremely weak and sometimes required resuscitation. Even foals that survived beyond birth never lived beyond 4 days old. They were often born dehydrated, hypothermic, and tachycardic, with low white blood cell counts and acidosis, but blood cultures rarely showed bacterial infections. As for horses other than pregnant mares, FP cases had enlarged hearts with up to 3 liters of fluid in the pericardial cavity, and these horses did not survive. Horses experiencing unilateral uveitis did recover, and no eyes ended up needing removed. This is generally good that horses got to keep their eyes, but it also meant that no dissections or tests could be performed to try to identify an infectious agent. During this time, there were also reports of meningoencephalitis, and brain isolates from euthanized horses that had suffered this showed similar bacteria to MRLS. But what would immediately make someone connect foal loss, uveitis, and meningoencephalitis? Especially since these cases were spread across the state and not isolated to any one farm or area. Because farms that did experience MRLS did tend to experience it heavily, an environmental toxin was an initial guess. However, there was no evidence to show that this was the case. Nitrate toxicity was also a guess, but fetal fluid sample analyses showed no sign of this either. Mycotoxins, ergot alkaloid poisoning, or phytoestrogen interactions were all ruled out early in the 2001 outbreak too. Eventually, someone identified a similarity on every farm that was experiencing large cases of MRLS. The trees. Farms that had high cases of fetal loss had cherry trees present in their pastures. Cherry trees have the potential to cause prussic acid poisoning. Prussic acid is better known as cyanide, an extremely toxic and deadly substance. When the cells in the leaves of cherry trees are broken, compounds can interact to create cyanide gas. While this can occur from the manual crushing of leaves, it can also occur during a frost. Just like if you leave a full can of pop in your car in the winter, the fluid will expand when it freezes and burst the pop can. The same thing happens when the fluid within the cells freezes and leads to them bursting, and then cyanide gas is produced. Cyanide poisoning, however, is usually extremely apparent and rapid, and no evidence of cyanide poisoning was seen in the horses experiencing MRLS. And why had these trees not been an issue before? The trees themselves didn't seem to be causing the fetal loss, but science doesn't accept anything as coincidence, so the experts kept on investigating. A University of Kentucky meteorologist noted that the weather patterns leading up to MRLS in 2001 may have caused an explosion of biological activity that might have led to this high rate of fetal loss. That meteorologist was right. It was found that a higher than normal rate of eastern tent caterpillars had emerged during the spring of 2001. And where do eastern tent caterpillars live, you ask? You guessed it, cherry trees. This seemed like the breakthrough that everyone was waiting for, but no one was taking any deep breaths yet. Why would a caterpillar be causing so many mares to lose their foals? When these caterpillars consume the leaves of the cherry tree, the cyanide produced upon the crushing of the cells is converted within the caterpillar to mandelonitrile. It was thought that this compound must have a toxic effect on horses and cause enough illness to render a fetus not viable or cause abortion. Scientists isolated the mandelonitrile from the caterpillars and gave it at extremely high doses to pregnant test mares. The mares got mild diarrhea but otherwise recovered quickly, and the fetuses were completely fine. If this extremely high isolated dose of this compound didn't cause abortion, there's no way mares could accidentally eat enough caterpillars in the field to poison themselves with it either. Another dead end. Now, sidebar, I know if you're not familiar with research, it might sound really cruel to try to induce abortion in pregnant mares, but you have to remember that that is how we save more horses in the future. And in this case, if they were, giving horses something that they thought would make them sick or cause abortion, they would be under 24/7 surveillance, and they have the best veterinarians and, other helpers on hand to make sure that nothing bad happens to the horse if they can help it. But they need to be able to scientifically prove, okay, this is what's causing this, or say, well, we tried this and that wasn't causing it, so back to the drawing board. So try not to feel too bad that they're purposefully dosing horses with these things. That's just how research works. There's also a lot of clearance that you have to get to do research with animals to ensure that you're treating them humanely and ethically. So it's a very supervised process, that no one's just poisoning random horses out in a pasture and seeing what happens. So anyway, back to the research. In 2001, another study was done in which a group of pregnant mares was exposed to eastern tent caterpillars in the pasture, and a control group was put in a pasture with no eastern tent caterpillars. 7 of the 10 mares in the caterpillar pasture aborted their fetuses, but so did 3 of the mares in the control pasture. This seemed like another dead end until researchers discovered that the caterpillars had escaped the pasture where they were supposed to be and made their way to the control pasture. In a way, this was kind of a success because it showed that it was indeed the caterpillars that caused fetal loss, but they still didn't know why. Various studies were done to confirm that yes, the caterpillars did indeed cause fetal loss, even if they weren't from Kentucky. They tested caterpillars from elsewhere to see if maybe it was an environmental toxin or other factor that was making these eastern tent caterpillars in Kentucky cause the abortions, but they didn't see any difference when they tried it with eastern tent caterpillars from Michigan. All of this led researchers to wonder which part of the caterpillar was causing the MRLS. A study was done in which the insides of the caterpillar were separated from the outer skin or shell of the caterpillar and fed to different groups of pregnant mares. Mares who were fed the insides of the caterpillar did not experience any fetal loss, but those who were fed the outside of the caterpillar did. Scientists were starting to narrow things down, but they still needed to know more. More studies were done to try to determine what about the outside of the caterpillars was causing MRLS. In the blog version of the podcast that I put on my website, you can find links that will get you in-depth information about all of the studies conducted if you're interested, but I didn't want to get too far into the weeds about them here. But some work was done to try to sterilize the outside of the caterpillars to see if perhaps they carried an infectious agent that caused fetal loss, but that wasn't the case either. Even mares that were fed sterilized caterpillars would still abort their fetuses and have evidence of bacterial invasion, but they knew that it wasn't coming from the caterpillar because the caterpillar had been sterilized. Studies were either sterilizing them with alcohol or irradiation or something else, so they knew that the caterpillar wasn't bringing bacteria in with it. In the meantime of all of this research, breeding farms were doing all they could to keep their pregnant mares away from eastern tent caterpillars. Some farms cut down their cherry trees, while others sprayed for caterpillars or just removed pregnant mares from pastures where these caterpillars were identified during peak caterpillar presence. After several studies, it was then noticed that the bacteria often identified in these MRLS cases was the same bacteria that is found in the oral cavity of healthy adult horses. This then led scientists to put together the most plausible answer for what happened. Eastern tent caterpillars and many other caterpillars are covered in setae, or hairs. When horses accidentally ingest these caterpillars, the setae cause lesions in the digestive tract of the horses. This then provides an entrance for opportunistic bacteria to enter the bloodstream and cause infection. Also, the individual setae off the caterpillars can work their way into the bloodstream. I've read some alternate theories about why the effect of this was so pronounced in pregnant mares. One source suggested that this infection targeted the reproductive tract of pregnant mares due to their reduced immune response in these areas during pregnancy. Another source, which again is linked in the show notes on my website, noted that this infection manifested mostly in the uterus due to the high amount of extracellular fluid. If bacteria or caterpillar hairs ended up in the fetal fluid, so the amniotic fluid where the fetus is living and floating, the bacteria can multiply rapidly in that fluid, and the immune system can't control it as well as it can if it were to invade other areas of the body. The same can be said for the eye on a smaller scale, hence why they would get uveitis in maybe one eye but not the other. It just depended on where it ended up. And manifestation of these infections as pericarditis is inevitable if the setae or bacteria are in the bloodstream, because they would surely end up at the heart at some point. To this day, the only known prevention for MRLS is to avoid exposure of horses, especially pregnant mares, to eastern tent caterpillars. Studies on MRLS were and still are limited due to the time and expense associated with investigating fetal loss caused by these caterpillars. From everything I've read from folks who were involved in investigating MRLS, it was a hectic time. Everyone was scrambling to figure out what was going on, and not only is horse breeding a massive part of the economy here in Kentucky, it's also so tragic to see so many mares lose their foals in such a short time and not be able to do anything to stop it. When a similar abortion outbreak occurred in Australia a few years later, a horse farm owner recognized the similarities and contacted the scientists in the US who had worked on MRLS. It was eventually found that equine amnionitis and fetal loss, the Australian version of MRLS, was caused by processionary caterpillars. This phenomenon has also been paralleled in camels. It had been well understood for many years in Saharan camel pastoralist cultures that caterpillars can cause abortion in camels. I've not been able to find any evidence of MRLS or similar epidemics occurring in recent years. While it's tragic that such a large portion of the foal crop was lost during MRLS outbreaks, it spurred an advance in science that has surely saved thousands of foals over the past 20 years. And surely will also make diagnosing similar cases easier in the future, such as the one that occurred in Australia. I know this isn't a traditional Hayloft Hour true crime story, but sometimes tragedies are real mysteries and the responsible party isn't human. We just barely scratched the surface of MRLS in this episode, so if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to check out the links that I post in the show notes that'll be on my website in blog format. You can find that on SpottedBay.com. If you enjoy this podcast, please follow wherever you listen and share it with a friend. It really does help me out. If you have a story suggestion, you can email it to me at SpottedBay@gmail.com or submit it via the contact form on my website. Be sure to follow us everywhere on social media to keep up with what I do when I'm not writing podcast episodes. As always, thanks again so much for your support, and I'll catch you next time.